we're ready to start, I'll do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, it looks like it's starting. Somebody else turned it on.
Oh,
There we go. Yeah, I've got the record button, the icon go showing.
That was me. I just turned it on.
Okay,
So,
great.
Darla.
Thanks, Darla.
Tanya, can I give you the power and control? I don't know why I've got it.
You're on as a co-host.
Yeah, let me give it to, who should I give it to? I don't want to be a co-host.
Oh, we're all co-hosts.
Oh, okay.
I think
we
I
can
just
have
don't see the record button because I'm sharing the screen. That's what I'm suspecting.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for doing this, Scott.
Yeah, no problem. This is great. I'm really glad that Brenda reached out and I've been following your newsletters. I think it's, yeah, wonderful that you're staying in as much contact with everybody as you can. It's kind of what we need.
The ladies are quite amazing, that's for sure.
And you've been doing a few of these, haven't you, Scott?
I've done, yeah, this will be my second one, actually. I've done one already, but I have one next week. So there's kind of like, there's a whole bunch all sort of scheduled together.
I saw that. What county are you doing next week?
I think Skagit County
Yeah.
next
I
week,
think I saw
if I recall.
flyer. Yeah.
Yeah, the parent-to-parent group up there.
Yep.
Mhm.
Oh.
I've been up there before, so I mean they were kind of nice enough to reach out again. And that's been good. And we've been mostly talking with school district administrators. I mean that our office has been in, over August in the summer, constantly trying to communicate with district administrators.
I bet.
Because things are changing, or they were changing so rapidly for a while.
All right.
The ones that you've done, are they recorded that we could also listen to or no?
I believe so. The last one was recorded. It was by the special ed PTA group up in Seattle Public Schools. So I don't know where they posted it or not, but I believe it was recorded as well. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but for those who come in later, the agenda is on the chat box so they can see it here. So
Okay.
whenever
Should we
you want to
get started?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for having me. I'll introduce myself here and share my screen so you kind of see what we're going to talk about. Here it is. Okay.
Before we get started, maybe I'll make sure that people understand that this is being recorded. And so if you don't want your voice to be on the recording, that's another reason. Well, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat box and then we can verbalize it for you, or Scott can verbalize it if he wants to.
And we'll stop towards the end, right? To in
For
case
free
people
time.
want. Yeah.
Right. Thank you both. Yes, I'll be sure to sort of take breaks or stop in the at different segments just to take some questions and make sure we're all on the same page. Here's the topic for today. We're going to just basically talk about the situation we're all in and how does special education services sort of work or fit when we're all dealing with COVID-19. To sort of start us off, I want to make sure that everyone who's involved in listening to the presentation knows that these are the vision, mission, and values that the superintendent's office puts forth, and it tries to guide kind of the work and what we're doing. And so we sort of put this at the front of everything we do. It's important. I'm going to come back to some of these topics. I think it's really important that we try to actually live what we say here, and particularly the values about equity and collaboration, continuous improvement, and focusing on the whole student. Equity is something that's really critical, I think, at this point, given what we're all experiencing, and what does that mean? We're really trying to reflect upon what does equity mean in each particular context, and so we have this equity statement to refer back to as well. Here's the agenda, if you will, the different topics I'd like to cover. And I mentioned I'll stop after each one to kind of make sure we can get a burning question answered. As well as I've interspersed questions throughout, the sort of common questions I've been receiving so far. In my role, I do work at the superintendent's office. I'm in the special ed division, and I'm the parent and community liaison. That is my role, is specifically to be out talking to parents, families, community members, the public at large. I talk to administrators, basically anyone who has a question about how special ed works in our state. I'm meant to be a resource and a point person. And I bring a lot of that feedback that I get to our office, and helps us approach everything with a sort of a rounded point of view. So the big topics today, we'll talk about the big picture. We'll talk about implementing IEPs, given the different types of instructional models being used. I will try to talk about the differences between compensatory education and this term recovery services that's been out there, new sort of term developed. We'll talk about IEPs and timelines and evaluations in general. And I'll sort of wrap up with some mention of the procedural safeguards that families have, and dispute resolution, how that works, and any final questions. So hopefully we'll have time for all that. Now I'll cover the first part rather quickly, because the big picture is kind of what we're all experiencing right now. What's the current guidance, what's out there to know about. First, in the big picture is, how do we address basic education? All students receiving special ed services are basic education students first, and it's good to know what the basic education requirements are in our state. Each district, to that first point, was directed to develop a reopening plan for the fall. And there's a link here of a list that's maintained for what each district plans would be. And this applies to all districts, charters, and tribal compact schools in our state. It was due the first 2 weeks for whenever that school district was starting in the fall. So I believe there's many districts who have started already. And so these are hopefully published on the district website if the public and families want to know about it. And OSPI has committed to the value of continuing to engage and work with families in the development of these plans, and that these plans should adjust throughout the year because things are rapidly sometimes changing. The special ed department in particular at OSPI, this is what we put out. This is the guidance document that sort of is the companion that goes along with what do special ed services look like in the situation that we're in. We have all these different models, as you've seen, that are kind of being floated out there, and each district is taking a different approach. And this kind of quote is one that I think stood out to me, so I grab it to kind of highlight that one of the big issues when it comes to students who have IEPs is making sure that there's equity in terms of access to general education and access to the services that our students that need across opening models. So we're going to come back to that, but this is the guidance that's out there in the link. This is the longer version of the document, by the way. This is the big one. I think it's upwards of 70, 80 pages.
Wow.
And that's why they're here. I'll link to something that's perhaps a little bit more relevant. Is this first point is the summary for families. It's been distilled down to about 4 or 5 pages, where in each section there's a couple, 2, 3, 4 points that are the relevant high points to understand when it comes to how special ed services should look in our state. And this language, this document has been translated into multiple languages. So it's available on the OSPI website. This link will take you there. The second point is another link on our website specific to students who have IEPs and different resources that have been culled together. Available both to educators and even families alike. The third point is specific to early childhood programs. What do they look like? And the fourth point is a general Q&A kind of technical document that I think many school district administrators are utilizing, but it is certainly informative to the general public as well to kind of understand in a Q&A format what to expect. And that last point is the link that takes you to the page that has all these things together. But this is kind of these are the sort of main points I would focus on in terms of what guidance is coming out from OSPI currently. And the other big thing to keep it in mind with the big picture is that we're all kind of reacting to and working in conjunction with what the Department of Health is saying. The Department of Health and also the Department of Labor and Industries has a big role in this. Primarily, the Department of Health has put out guidance for K-12 schools. The most recent update that I've seen is September 2nd. That's what this link will give you to the guidance document as to the health guidelines. And it varies, of course, across our state based on what county you're in terms of the amount of social distancing, or at least the access to the buildings, and what are the requirements for providing in-person instruction. So this is going to vary from county to county, but at least there's a guidance document that's sort of the grounding to go refer back to that we're all kind of utilizing. And from here, you'll see the Department of Health put out what they call a decision tree for when services should resume in person. And I think you'll see that there's many districts who are modeling this in terms of how they're making decisions about in-person instruction. They'll have a decision tree of their own to be used on a case-by-case basis for students who are receiving special education services and students in general. So, but this is the big picture one that's out from the Department of Health. So there's a link to that. And we'll start getting into more details sort of next about how to implement and use, IEPs and the different various models. But I do want to pause just to make sure, and I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment to see if there's a chat box question or a question somebody wants to put out right now.
Well, I had one. You mentioned that each district had kind of its own solution. I understood you to say that, but I find that even more so, even each school kind of has its own solution.
Each school having its own decisions about in-person instruction?
Yes, and how things are run. It's just extraordinarily different to me, each school that I'm learning about, but I guess that's just part of the drill.
Right, I think that's makes sense because there's a lot of physical requirements, in terms of the building and how you arrange the physical sort of arrangement of a classroom that's included in the Department of Health guidance. So that would be something that would be relevant, probably more on a building by building, classroom by classroom level. So there could be some differences even within a district with regard to how much in-person instruction can or even could safely be offered. Because I think this goes back to the question of equity. I mean, which students need the resources the most? And then also, how can those resources be provided safely in terms of instructional resources? And who are we asking to take the largest risks here? Those are all factors that are being considered. And so I think that's the hardest part about where we're at, is that there is no consistency from one district, even from building to building, or even district to district at the moment.
Yeah.
Everyone's trying to be as thoughtful about this as possible. So one district may be doing one thing and using one model. The district, even just next door, may be doing something different. In OSPI, it's rather difficult for one standard to be applied other than to follow your local health department guidance.
Yeah.
So we can get into a couple of those standards. I don't see a lot of chat box questions. If there's any other questions, then we can address them as we go through. That's the big picture at the moment.
Sure.
Let me pull up my screen again.
I like your background.
Thanks. That is not me. I wish it were, but I do like to play volleyball. That's my sort of favorite pastime. I grew up in Southern California, so that was something that I was a lot of access to and really enjoy as much as I can. But I get the question, is that you? No, yeah, I wish it were. I am not that athletic or tall. So going back to the next topic, sort of implementing IEPs. How do we do this given the various remote models we have? Sort of some big ideas at first to sort of take away from our office kind of going forward, the guidance that's gone out to districts about how do we go forward in this situation. First and foremost, in the spring, during the sort of building closures that happened immediately when the outbreak or the start of this pandemic, there was a lot of continuous learning plans being used. And those plans were essentially meant to sort of bridge the immediate emergency or gap that had been created by the buildings being closed. The big idea is now we are moving away from continuous learning plans, or CLPs, districts have called them. They all have various names, and there's no longer a state of emergency in the sense of buildings immediately have closed. Now there's been a little more time to plan, and so the expectation is we move away from continuous learning, whatever that was called, that we did in the spring. And now we're going to be more proactive, more transparent, and have more frequent communication with families. That's what's expected. Better pre-planning, essentially. This third point is what we've been talking about, that in-person instruction is not something that's required. Like OSPI has not set out a mandate across the state that all instruction has to be in person, either at home or in the school. There's just too much variability with health and safety requirements to make that feasible. So those decisions are being made on a case-by-case basis within each district, sometimes, as we've heard, from building to building within a district. But one of the other big picture sort of ideas at that fourth point here is that students with IEPs, we're seeing this as an issue sometimes, is that students with IEPs, they still need to have access to the general education curriculum and instruction with the accommodations that they need or in accordance with the IEPs that provide accommodations. So we can't forget that, general education is essentially remote right now. And that students who have an IEP, they have every right to access that general education classroom just as before. So with that, just to continue on this first point, that in thinking about remote learning, the home setting is what everyone is generally in, and that's generally going to be defaulted to, or we consider that now the general ed setting as the starting point for any conversation. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are not special ed settings, that a special ed teacher may have a sort of a Zoom classroom or a remote classroom doing special ed instruction for a student, or there may be individual sessions happening remotely. There could even be in a hybrid learning model in some in-person instruction happening specific to IEP services. Sure, that's still a special education setting, given who's involved in that type of learning. But a big picture idea is that, since we're all in this remote sort of situation together, if we're all at home, then we're going to consider the general ed setting to be at home. The emphasis from OSPI and our office has been on training and support for school staff, families, on how do we adapt to this new environment. We need to learn to use technology as it states here, talk about how do we design lessons and instruction that benefit all, general ed as well as students receiving special ed services, and how do we maintain a focus on inclusionary practices as we do our work. Special ed and general ed services can be indirect, or what's commonly called asynchronous type of learning, where there's sort of pre-recorded programs or videos, modified online programs, work packets. We consider all that still a type of learning that can take place in either setting. And one of the big focuses that OSPI has had our office has been a value or an emphasis on continuing to monitor and document what's happening, what progress, if any, or lack thereof, has been made. If there's a gap, we want to know about that too. So progress of any kind, and being proactive again about trying to resolve concerns about how to access instruction. This is the big ideas sort of from our office. You know, what is the special ed division of OSPI focusing on? This is kind of summarizes that. And a common question about this continuous learning plans I want to throw out there that I've received, that our office has received, is if we're going to move away from continuous learning plans that we did in the spring, the question has been, how should my school be using that information from last spring to guide sort of the fall? Are the IEP teams supposed to consider data collected by parents as a part of the progress reporting too? The answer to all that is yes. Like, even though we're moving away from continuous learning plans, the continuous learning plans, or whatever they were called in the spring, summer, this past year, that's still a way to document what happened. And it was important to use that documentation because IEP teams can use that information to inform how it's going to look differently or what needs to happen in the fall. And any progress that's been collected, noted from parents, any gaps that parents are seeing, that's important for IEP teams to consider when you start determining what the fall is going to look like, and when we talk later about what is a recovery service going to look like, how are we going to recover from the pandemic and the situation that's been created. So even though we're moving away from CLPs, we're not going to focus on those kinds of documents. They're still important and as a relevant sort of piece of information. So this is sort of a...
Sorry, there's a couple questions in the chat box. Can we take a break to answer them? I'll read them to you.
Sure, but we can read them, or I'll probably stop momentarily, just a couple more points, and then we can stop and discuss some of these questions. So
sure,
whatever you like.
Sure.
If you want to ask the questions now, if they're...
Sure. So one of them was, how is it determined about the need of students receiving special services in the equity sense, by race, income, etc.?
In the equity sense, is that what you said?
Yeah, and I think that was asked a couple slides ago, so it might be in regards to how the services are determined right now with I don't know if the person that asked wants to elaborate on that, or?
Well, I was going to talk about this a little bit later when we get to this idea of recovery services, and how do we determine those. Their recovery services is this idea of yes, trying to put forth the value of equity into the conversation, that students need to get what they need in order to fulfill some of these gaps. And maybe our traditional ways of addressing lost minutes or services that weren't met in an IEP, minute by minute kind of situation doesn't really fit, particularly since we're all in a remote setting. So the conversation about equity is, what does the student need? How do we meet the student's needs where they're at and dedicate the resources rather than sort of feel like we have to adhere to a minute by minute structure within an IEP. And so it allows some flexibility in the conversation. And as we'll talk about, I think I want to get to this a little bit later, is that because it's so flexible, there's also some flexibility in terms of what are the requirements here. There aren't some set requirements that OSPI is able to set down, but I can get into more of those details, I think, as we move on.
Thank you. There's another question saying, access to LRE is coming up with a number of families. Many students were able to access Gen Ed with a paraeducator support, and parents trying to work from home while students are quote unquote in school cannot fill that para role. So students aren't able to access Gen Ed quote unquote Zoom classrooms. What options are left to provide that equity?
Right. I mean, that needs to be discussed with an IEP team. If a student is unable to access the material, because they don't have access to the one-to-one paraeducator support that they typically would have in a classroom, then the conversation needs to shift to what else can be done. How can we rethink the way we are delivering instruction, or ways in which we are, what kind of expectations we have for the student to be able to show the work that they're doing. What sort of strengths can we play upon in this setting that the student can show and demonstrate learning without the one-to-one paraeducator support, or with the kind of support that we are able to provide. So that's a hard question, because there's no way in which we can mandate one-to-one support in a health crisis. That needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis. And if that one-to-one support can't be provided, then there needs to be some conversation about, well, what can we do in the alternative? And there is a question I want to get to specifically on that, because this is coming up quite frequently. And so I think this is a good way to sort of transition back, if that's okay. And to kind of go along those lines with those questions, I mean, what we're going to expect going into the fall is that first and foremost, we have an IEP that outlines services, that's the district's offer of free appropriate public education. That's just sort of top line here. We all know how to function with an IEP. There's an annual meeting, has to be in place. Student progress is monitored. Those services are provided. We're trying to eliminate this sort of middle bar where it says in the spring we did continuous learning. It's what was called continuous learning plans in many respects. And that we want to reserve those or set those aside for if there's any kind of unplanned emergency situation that happens again, then we'll kind of move into that. But for right now, we want to set those aside and use those only as a reference document for what happened in the spring and determining what we're going to do in the fall. And what we do in the fall, one mechanism here is an IEP amendment. This is where there's an opportunity as an IEP team to do an amendment for what the fall should look like. And as this last sort of arrow at the bottom points out, it could be meant to do a temporary change in services, because some things will change from month to month or from semester to semester. But IEP amendments are how we want to document any kind of changes to the IEP going forward. So like I said, the big takeaways here is that IEPs should be implemented to the fullest extent possible, kind of as written. And then you use the amendment to reflect any adjustments that need to happen, either based on the model that's been chosen by the district or because of the health and safety circumstances and guidelines that need to be followed. We mentioned that they should be temporary, but one thing to keep in mind that an IEP amendment should never last longer than that annual IEP date, because IEPs have to be renewed every year. And so you can't have an amendment that lasts longer than the renewal date. So amendments are typically time bound in this sense. And the question that comes up is about reevaluations. They're not always needed if you're only changing the method of how a service is delivered. The last point here is that IEP teams, they determine when a reevaluation is needed. For example, when there's a significant change in services, either more or less than what was in the current IEP, or when the current information that you need in order to develop a new IEP is sort of insufficient or outdated, if more new information is needed. That's typically when a reevaluation would come into the picture, because even right now in the situation we're in, reevaluations can be difficult or take longer due to the social distancing and health guidelines. Quickly, some examples that have come up about implementing IEPs, in a remote learning setting, both direct instruction called synchronous or indirect asynchronous. All those kind of minutes can still count as that specially designed instruction or related service within an IEP. They still need to be designed and supervised and monitored by the appropriate personnel, usually special ed teacher or a related service provider. One example that's sort of listed here in terms of minutes, if you're in a remote setting, if an IEP, for instance, talked about 30 minutes a week of speech with a speech language pathologist, SLP, and then now that shifts to a virtual session for 30 minutes, that might be an example of where the amount of time and the setting, a special ed setting, it all remains the same. An IEP could be implemented without an amendment in this type of situation, because you're still essentially meeting it as needed, as written. For example, in a hybrid learning situation where some services may be in person or some may be remote, if districts are doing that, it should still be documented what's happening. And the change in methodology versus sort of synchronous or in-person versus asynchronous is not necessarily what needs to be, that doesn't necessarily automatically trigger sort of an IP, amendment, but it should just be documented as this is the methodology, maybe in a letter like a prior written notice, an agreement that the IEP team has made. So for example here, there's sort of an IEP that indicated 30 minutes a day of instruction and math in a general ed setting. And in a hybrid situation, the district may offer the in-person math instruction from a general ed teacher for 30 minutes, 2 days a week in person. And there may be a paraeducator support there. And then there could also be remote sessions available online with a small group, with the general ed teacher also there. The services are essentially the same amount of time and could be the same setting in the general ed setting. An amendment may not be necessary. What's still relevant here is that you would still have that specially designed instruction being designed by a special ed teacher, and there still be progress that's important to be monitored by both the general ed teacher and the special ed teacher as to how this is all going in terms of access to instruction, progress that could be expected to be made towards the goal. So those kind of conversations are what we are pushing or hoping districts to have with you and your IEP teams. And common questions that have come up, there's sort of the two I wanted to talk about, and then we could take a little bit pause. Questions that come up about whether the district can just send you a prior written notice, that PWN, which is a document with the proposed changes. Can they just send me one of those in the fall? Or do you require to have an IEP meeting first? It depends in certain situations that an IEP, for example, changes can be made without a meeting if, number one, if parents agree with those changes, then you don't need to have an IEP meeting. There's no requirement that an IEP meeting is needed formally anytime to make a change. There can be sort of an agreement via email, for example, or by phone that, those are the changes we're going to take place, and the district would document that still in the prior written notice. If families or parents disagree with the changes anytime, requesting an IEP team meeting prior to those changes taking effect. Parents have that ability. And as we sort of mentioned in some of those examples of how learning might look in this situation, IEP amendments, they may not be needed if really what's only changing is the method of how a service is delivered. Prior written notice may be used as a way to just communicate the method or the, how the service will be delivered is not necessarily considered an amendment in that situation. One other question that already we talked about briefly is that the paraeducators, what are they going to look like in this situation? The question about how do districts implement IEPs that call for a one-to-one service? Is it possible to get that kind of in-person support even in the home? Or the question has come up, well, what if I hire my own kind of support and the district expected to reimburse? We got ahead of ourselves a little bit, but the answer is kind of, it depends here on what the IEP team determines, the kind of supports that are needed and how they'll be provided given current health and safety guidelines. There's no requirement that districts would be reimbursing families for any sort of private services obtained, but that would be part of the discussion. It's free to bring it up if you need to. But really, this needs to be a conversation with an IEP team about what are things going to look like given the student's needs, given the certain circumstances, and given that because the health guidelines, we can't get someone to work in person with all students. So lastly, the progress reports. I talked about how important this was, and the questions that do come up about why my team has not shared progress monitoring on my students' goals, and when should I be receiving this information? Refer back to your IEP. I mean, that's the answer. Is the information should be provided both on request and in accordance with the IEP. Progress reports, that requirement has not changed or been waived in any way in terms of sort of state standards or state rules. And progress reports, they should be considering a variety of ways to collect data. As we talked about earlier, what parents see in the home is important data points or of information to be sharing with districts, and districts should be asking and seeking and documenting those, what they can with regard to our current situation. So I know this is probably a good point to pause, and that's where I wanted to kind of set up a break to make sure if there's a question or two kind of around this topic of implementing an IEP, given the circumstances we're in. You can kind of pause here and take some of those questions, I think. And I'll read some of that. I can see if that is helpful. Let's see. A question about access to LRE. I think, okay, the in-person question. Oh, paraeducator support. And what options are provided. We addressed that sort of question already. I think that it really depends. What options are available is you have to talk with the district and the IEP team to see what kind of resources are available within the district, given county health guidelines and even district resources that are available at the moment. And I think, to insert equity into the conversation, I think we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to just what can the special ed department provide. I think it's intentional to mention that, general education is in this situation too, and that general education teachers, for instance, maybe need to pay more attention to the fact that some students may need additional support, more support than others. Not all students need to be spending, 5 hours a day, online, for instance, in order to make progress. General ed teacher from perhaps start thinking about how do they divide up their time and attention to address the needs of the students who may be falling behind or where the gaps are a little bit more significant than others. I think inserting those conversations about spreading out time and resources equitably. I think we could talk about the next segment about recovery services and what that means. But I think that's how we sort of address this lack of support that we can provide in person.
Hi, Scott.
Hi, there's a
This
question.
is
Hi, Jerry.
Yeah, that was my question. And I super appreciate your answer. And it's basically in alignment with the guidance that PAVE's been giving too. But this is the topic that's coming up the most with the families that PAVE is trying to help. Schools are very focused on what they're providing and less focused on follow-up with, is that accessible? Right? So they're keeping careful track of what minutes are being offered. Are they general education minutes? Are they special education minutes? I think the schools are doing their due diligence in terms of tracking what's offered. But I've got parents calling saying, I'm going to lose my job if
Right.
I keep trying to keep my kid on these calls, these Zoom meetings with class. My kid cannot attend to this, can't sign on independently, can't stay on, can't stay focused. So that access is not working, right? So the minutes are being provided, but they're not accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not bumping into a lot of IEP teams with the creativity needed to troubleshoot that, to come
Right.
up with how then do we make this accessible. And whether it's access to least restrictive environment and general education, or access even to the special education, if the student can't activate this independently, and there isn't, because of health and safety, a one-on-one support person, I think everybody's just kind of stuck in
Right.
that place. I mean, we kind of know what the rules are, we know what the requirements are, we know how to document, but everybody's just kind of stuck. Like, has anybody come up with any kind of creative problem solving around that accessibility piece?
No, I don't think there's a easy answer for that. I think that what you're saying is incredibly important, and I think it's important to push through it. I think right now that's what we need to challenge, district administrators and educators to kind of rethink access and what it means. I think at OSPI, the conversation has been about how do we create the structures to enable that to happen. And I think this shift, I'd like to think it's coming, hopefully, because we are just getting back into the swing of a school year again. So that's my optimistic take on it. But right, I think it does really challenge our notions of how we've delivered services in the past and what we expect learning to look like. For example, some of the structures I think that enable some flexibility include attendance requirements. There's a great deal of flexibility when it comes to attendance. So for working families, hopefully it's been communicated that the attendance rules are flexible, that work sort of attendance can be shown in various ways, even after the fact, for instance, kind of working independently or working in sort of, I guess, non-school hours should still count for instruction. And if that's not working, then I would encourage families to talk to teachers and IEP teams about what does work for them. And that's where you push and challenge to say, let's come up with something that actually meets the needs of my student at this time. Given the restrictions, there's no, we're not gonna, I don't know when we're gonna be able to do in-person instruction in all cases. And in some cases, that's not the most equitable approach, perhaps, because why should we be subjecting students who receive IEP services to any greater risk than any other student in some cases here? So
Yeah.
I mean, that's a factor that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents feel like they're kind of fighting with their kids right now because they can't get them to do what they're supposed to do.
Right.
And so I've been trying to help families creatively think about how to talk with the school about getting the students engaged in mastery, in, feelings of belonging and inspiration to learn, so that it doesn't feel like a fight all day, every day. But that's
Right.
hard. And that's not really the approach the schools are taking with a lot of these situations. The schools are telling the parents it's on them to get their kids online. It's on them to make sure their kids attend. It's on them to, if we're offering what we're offering, and if your child isn't signing on, then we can't help, is what a lot of parents are being told. And that
Right.
doesn't address the accessibility piece. So I think there's just a lot of conversation that needs to keep happening on those topics.
Right.
Thank you.
I think it's a good point you bring up. I do want to talk about that more because later in the sort of the next couple of topics, I think we'll address that. And I think your observation is correct. I mean, the way I put it is, yeah, I feel like right now there is a sense that we're stuck in what we know, and we keep trying to recreate the school day online. And I don't think that's going to work in all situations, and I don't think that's the most equitable approach in all situations. Because, like I said before, some students may not need the full school day in order to, maintain progress or sort of keep up. because other students, the gaps may be more significant. And so the school day needs to look different, and how we deliver services may need to look different, and perhaps more of that time needs to be spent on addressing the needs of the students who need it the most, especially given the challenges that remote and distancing learning really create, because we can't be there in person safely sometimes. And so I think that my optimistic take is hopefully we will back off from this as we continue to learn as we go through it. If the spring taught us anything, I think that this is hard and that we need to really be innovative in how we approach this. So we're not going to forget what we should learned in the spring. And at the same time now, as we try to recreate something in the fall, you're going to hear lots of conversations about the push for in-person instruction again, since that's what we know. And yet at the same time, hopefully there's flexibility to address the fact that, some families may not want in-person instruction because it's not safe. And that some families have different circumstances that don't enable them to sort of always follow the school day as it's being created online very easily. So I think that these conversations need to happen, and IP teams can have them. I mean, I think hopefully the first part with IEP is going back to the IEP as it's written. There is some creativity or flexibility in how we're going to deliver services in terms of the method of delivery and the timing. There can be some adjustments here. And that's kind of what this first takeaway should be, I think, is that in how we deliver services, there should be some flexibility in that. Let me use this as a way to sort of step back into the conversation. I'll share my screen again. And then we can kind of see a little bit more about this idea of gaps. And compensatory education is the term that's used a lot in special ed when an IEP is not being followed, or when a district has denied the student an appropriate education. So that's the word we all know, is compensatory education. This idea of recovery services, I think, broadens what compensatory education should look like. And here's a comparison I want to bring up, because this is coming up quite a bit. This first column about compensatory education, that kind of reviews what we know already. It's something that was developed by the courts as a remedy. There's no set definition of what compensatory education is, but it's something you typically see ordered as a part of a complaint decision or a due process hearing decision. It's really if a student has been denied their free, appropriate public education FAPE. And compensatory education makes up for that by putting the student sort of back in the place they would have been if FAPE had not been denied. That last point here on the first column about compensatory education, it's a pretty standard accepted practice that it should be provided outside of the school day. That's what OSPI holds that standard, is that comp ed is something that's outside of the school day, because during the school days, an IEP should be followed. And that's how it's always been. So the idea of recovery services is the second column. This is the term that's been developed by OSPI. We're using it in the place of comp ed. It's really something, I think, if comp education is kind of like, compensatory education is kind of like the bigger umbrella. And because we're in a crisis mode here with the pandemic, we need to come up with something different. And recovery services sort of fits under that umbrella. And specifically to respond to COVID-19. Recovery services, I think, acknowledges that all learners are experiencing some type of trauma and gap in their learning right now because of what's happened with the building closures, and that we need some flexibility to be able to talk about a more equitable approach to meeting students' needs. How do we devote resources to the students who need it the most, for instance? IEP teams were being asked to determine on an individual basis what kind of recovery services are needed. And similar to comp ed, we would say that outside of the school day is the preferred way of providing recovery services. Now, an IEP team may decide otherwise. Because this is something that's been developed by OSPI, I mean, there's a flexibility in terms of how it would be provided. And if an IEP team thinks that this student's gaps or this student, the focus for this student needs to be kind of all day or for a couple weeks on a particular skill. And we're going to think about some way to recover those skills. We want to provide that flexibility. So this is sort of the side by side. When you hear this term thrown out there, it's in some of the guidance altogether. And we're talking about making up for lost time in the spring. It could be either one of these, really. But recovery services is really, I think, more tended to address the impact from COVID-19. Just to dig a little deeper into this recovery services idea, because this is sort of a hot topic about how are we going to make up for all this lost time. It has to be determined on a case-by-case basis, what type or how recovery services are going to look. They're not always, you shouldn't necessarily feel, I guess, constrained by the sort of time commitments that are in an IEP, like minute per minute, hour for hour kind of situation. And that really depends, again, on monitoring progress and, what are sort of the outcomes we're hoping for. The services should be provided to meet the student's needs in the most equitable way. And that's kind of how the recovery services are sort of framed. This idea of flexibility to go back again, that, if a student needs more resources, more time than perhaps another student gets, recovery services would be that flex point that allows the district to say, or the IP team to say that, we're going to set aside this amount of extra time or resources to address a gap in the student's learning right now. And we should talk about this last point is kind of to hit upon again, this idea that recovery services, even though there's the possibility of doing it during the school day, we really want to be careful not to make it lead to a more restrictive placement for the student or contribute to missing more general ed instruction. Because as I said at the outset, what I've been hearing in our office in general, there's this idea that sometimes students receiving special ed services are not even being given the opportunity to access the general education instruction that everyone else is still getting. So the idea that if you're going to focus on recovery services, keep in mind that we shouldn't be limiting student access to just general instruction in favor of recovery services. At least that's a hope here. Common question when I talk about this is, what's the timeline? When can I expect recovery services? Am I entitled to it, for example? There's no deadline or requirement. I mean, that's something that we simply cannot do at this point from the state standpoint. We don't see it as feasible to really say that it has to be provided by X date, because each IEP team needs to determine for each individual student what recovery is going to look like based on this crisis that we're in. And because we're still in the middle of a crisis, there's no requirement to provide it right now or right away. It doesn't have to be in the fall that we do recovery services. Some could be provided in the fall. Some could be provided later when we resume some kind of safe in-person or instruction, or when school operations go to resume as we know it. So that's sometimes the catch here. We have more flexibility to talk about this, this idea of what a student needs to recover from what's going on, and yet, we're not really in a situation where it can say that on this one particular case or this timeline or the district has to follow, it should happen. So IEP teams still need to be the ones that are having these sort of thoughtful conversations. And this idea of lack of progress, school districts are they required, for example, the question states to contact me about recovery services. Do they have to do a new evaluation? And then a timeline for all this. The answer to this is still no, that recovery services are not required. IEP teams, though, do need to assess the impact of what's happening on a student and the progress that, or lack thereof, that's being made. IEP teams still free to do a reevaluation as needed to gather information, as we talked about already, and that those timelines for reevaluation should still be followed. If that's what's needed to help an IEP team determine what is that gap, because sometimes we don't know the extent of it, then that's still possible. And that should be following the standard kind of process for a reevaluation still. And I think we'll talk about, you'll see in the next couple segments, I'll hit upon how OSPI is really focusing on the fact that we still need to continue to monitor progress, even though we're in a remote situation. And that may be difficult, but that's one of the benchmarks that I think OSPI has set down for districts, is to find a way to collect information and monitor the gaps or the progress that are being created. Let me stop here to make sure that we answer any questions about recovery services before we move into a little bit more about timelines and some of the other ideas about procedural safeguards and such. I'm reading a question about any circumstances for students who have aged out or graduated in spring 2020 coming back for recovery services. Yes, that's talked about, and I have heard that happening. Those, again, are being made on case-by-case basis, where students are still receiving some kind of recovery services based on what happened. It becomes a little bit more difficult if a student has graduated, because technically eligibility for special ed services ends upon graduation. So hopefully there's a conversation prior to the student graduating, but prior to sort of graduation, but prior to the diploma, for example, being in hand, there's a conversation about the need for transition services, 18 to 21 type post-secondary transition services, and that could include a recovery type services. So there's some flexibility here, but any student who's eligible for special education, we should be talking about how do we address the gaps that were created, how do we recover from this pandemic, even though we're still in the midst of it.
One of the families that I've been serving, Scott, she's quite an activist, the parent, and she is actually talking to lawmakers about a proposal for kind of a statewide system for tacking on some additional services to the end of the education for students who are getting pretty significant gaps throughout this whole pandemic process. And so I think it's a topic that needs further investigation, because regardless of the student's age, we don't know how long this is going to last. And the school districts are not going to be able to all of a sudden provide all of these services all at once when things are magically somehow back to something normal, right? So how is that going to get spaced out over time? Anyway, it was an interesting idea this parent had, I thought, for at end of school getting additional help.
I think it's a wonderful idea, personally speaking, and I have noticed, and very recently, actually, I think just this past, it was either end of last week or this week, that there's a proposal, I think, being put to legislators about extending eligibility age for services. I think that becomes a political question in some respects, because then there's questions about dollars and cents and the money that it requires for districts to do this. So I didn't want to wade into that too much, because I obviously can't predict what's going to happen on a legislative front. But given the structures that we already have, I think the question you put forth here is still relevant, is still exactly right, that there are circumstances where students who are aging out, reaching their sort of age limit of 21 or graduating, where the conversation about additional services to recover for what was lost in the spring or the summer can still be had. And there's nothing prohibiting districts from doing those kinds of services or providing those kind of services right now. I'm glad to jump back in. We talk a little bit about timelines, and if there's more questions, we can address them in the chat, or we'll stop again. I like to pause, that way we can have some reflection time and kind of see if more questions are percolating. A little bit more than halfway through, so that way that we can have good time to also answer questions towards the end. This sort of section here that I want to talk about is all about timelines related to IEPs and evaluations, because with the sudden building closures in the spring, there was a whole lot of upheaval and lots of questions arise about timelines. So what's the expectation then going forward into the fall about timelines? So the rules are still in effect, that IEPs are required to be in effect and implemented to start the 2021 school year, this school year. Annual IEP meetings and timelines should still be followed to the maximum extent possible. Conducting meetings at a distance if necessary. So annual IEPs every year, the IEP is updated. If that was missed in the spring, and then it should hopefully be a priority for correcting that by the fall. Or if a deadline is missed even now because of distance learning and sort of the remote social distancing aspect of meetings, still the directive from OSPI is to get those sort of up to date and have those meetings as quickly as possible. That's, if any delays have occurred, they're the priority, both IEPs and evaluations. Another note about evaluations is that parents should remember that they can agree to extend any evaluation timeline. Those agreements have to be documented, and it's not something that it's not like a signed parent consent requirement to extend a deadline for an evaluation. A simple agreement via email or whatever sort of method of documenting that, we agree to extend the timeline for an evaluation because we realize that we need more time due to social distancing or the availability of the student and the staff. So there's also no provision in the state rules to remember for extending an annual IEP. So, once an IEP has reached sort of a year limit, then a new one needs to be developed. If it's late, that's a problem. That's a procedural sort of error here. But the focus is on how do we correct it as quickly as possible. Because we understand that there's going to be a lot of delays based on what's been going on this past year. And so the focus now going into fall is to prioritize correcting that. But annual IEP meetings still need to happen as best as they can. So a common question that we've gotten, or I've gotten in particular, about remote learning and how much of a struggle it was. Can I request a meeting? What's the timeline? This idea that it's been thrown around that schools have 30 additional days to get IEPs in place or make changes from last spring. Is that correct? The answer is that IEPs need to be updated as soon as possible. This idea of 30 school days, there's a link here in the second point there. It came from an OSPI letter that came out last March. And quite frankly, this is still being updated, but it has to do more with the way in which school districts count students for reporting requirements to receive funding. And so that's why there's been a sort of a deadline for districts to get their IEPs and evaluations updated and to meet the timelines that they may have missed from the spring. So that's why there's a priority to get them done. Because there is still a sort of a monthly count that comes into place so that districts continue to receive the funds that are apportioned as a whole to serve students. But, this idea that if I request a meeting, what's the timeline that they will respond? We don't have a regulatory requirement in our state for responding to a meeting request. Districts are not required to always host a meeting when a parent requests it. That being said, if a parent does request a meeting, districts should answer the question. They should say, yes, well, we're glad to have a meeting. we need to do it maybe in a week or two from now. They need to, if they agree to a meeting, they should answer it and start making those arrangements. If they do say no to a meeting request, they should tell you why. Districts have to tell you why they're saying no, if they don't want to have a meeting at this time. And districts should document that. And in the absence of any district documentation, I would encourage parents to document the reasons that they're hearing themselves. A follow-up email, for example, is a great way to say thanks for the conversation. And I understand you don't want to have an IEP meeting at this time because you told me of this reason. If parents document that back to the district, then that's one way of making sure that parents are holding districts, accountable for the answers that they're giving. And then quickly about evaluations, both initial evaluations and reevaluations, those timelines. Evaluations still need to be as comprehensive as possible. They have to be sufficiently comprehensive, following all applicable health and safety guidelines. The most recent guidance about evaluations that has come out regarding how do we do this in a pandemic when we can't necessarily be in the same room with one another safely, or there's all these sort of guidelines to follow. There's a link in this page to the Washington State Association of School Psychologists that is a guidance document. It's not too lengthy, but it is, I think, dense in the sense of procedures, but it's still relevant to kind of refer back to if you ever had a question of what might it look like when a psychologist is doing an evaluation, a school psychologist, for instance. That's the latest guidance that I'm aware of, and that's what we've been pushing out in OSPI guidance and questions and answers. So there's a reference point if you as a family are interested. Initial evaluations still need to take place. So this idea of child find, initiating a referral for an initial evaluation for special ed services, all those processes and structures still need to be in place. So districts should have them, even though they're going to take place in a remote situation. And districts, they're still expected to follow every established timelines in our state. So currently it's 25 school days to respond to a request, to a referral, and then 35 school days to complete an evaluation once consent is signed. And if there's an agreement to extend the 35 school days as we talked about, that's still possible. If you're in a situation where an initial evaluation was requested, or you're in the middle of one, and the district has not come to a decision yet. I mean, OSPI has recommended that these sort of evaluations be completed to the greatest extent possible. And if there's some type of assessment that needs to happen in person, districts evaluation teams need to consider whether there's an alternative ways of doing it, or if they have enough information to go ahead and make a decision based on the information at hand, and then document an understanding that later on we will do additional assessments to reevaluate what the student needs. So we want to get these initial evaluations done and sort of having an answer one way or another as to the type of eligibility for special education services. Now, if you're in a situation where there's a reevaluation taking place, the process starts with a review of existing data. So there may need to be a reliance upon existing data in the first instance. So that's data or information that already exists. It's already available. It's information that the parents have provided. That's the parent input situation from perhaps a private assessment. All of these things are still relevant to a reevaluation, and the reevaluation may need to lean on them a little bit more to determine if additional services or if additional assessments are needed, and to kind of support eligibility for services. Going back to the timeline idea, one of the questions that I've received regarding requesting an evaluation before the pandemic started, and then the district has not finished it yet, and that my student needs specially designed instruction, special ed services in order to access the curriculum. How can we be compensated for this missed time once an IEP is in place? So this kind of question, first and foremost, that it's important to note that the evaluation should be the priority, because you need an evaluation in order to establish eligibility for special ed services. So that needs to be prioritized for completion. Once a team has enough information to support a decision, that should be made first. If the decision is that student is in need of special ed services, then the IEP team will determine what those services will look like, what any recovery services might be needed because of gap or delay in establishing eligibility. And then again, there's no requirement to do that or deadline, but that's when that part of the conversation comes up. But also, if this district were to determine that the student is not eligible for special ed services, this is a reminder that districts have to continue to have a process for Section 504 referrals. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a civil rights law, and so a Section 504 plan is still a possibility for a student who has a disability, substantially limits a major life activity like learning, for instance, and needs some accommodations in order to access the general curriculum. 504 plans are still, there's still a process and that's still in effect, even in a remote setting, if a student is somehow not eligible for special ed services. So I'm going to pause here because the timelines and questions sometimes come up around this. Kind of what's the expectation going forward? So I can pause if anyone's sort of thinking about anything and wants to ask about this topic of timelines.
You might want to talk a little bit about the continuous learning plan and how families can use that to calculate school days, because I think there's a lot of confusion around what the deadlines mean in light of when was school officially operating and not operating. I don't know if any of the families on this call have those questions, but some of the families who have contacted PAVE have had those questions.
Yeah, that was hard in spring to kind of figure out what was a school day and what was not. And this is a good segue, I think, into what we're going to talk about. But in terms of procedural safeguards and how OSPI has been resolving disputes around this. But first and foremost, there was a memo that went out, the bulletin from the superintendent's office, that put the sort of expectation on districts that continuous learning would begin on March 30th, 2020. So districts had to have that in place. So that's a good kind of starting point for asking and looking at, when did the district or was the district starting to provide educational opportunities, educational services to all students. And that becomes a school day once we start doing that. And so I think that's kind of the first date to keep in mind is what happened prior to or sort of starting after March 30th. And we can start counting then what were the days in which instruction was offered. That counts as a school day. If there's confusion over that, sure, there's bound to be some differences and discrepancies in how days are counted. OSPI has been a little bit forgiving of that, given the fact that buildings close pretty suddenly. And that's why we've said the priority is to now complete that as best you can right now in the fall. If it has not already been completed, then as a family, I would recommend to a family to bring that up and to prioritize and ask why is this completing this not the priority here? Because by the fall, by September, I think we should be trying to catch up from anything that happened in the spring. And if there's discrepancies over the counting of the days, let's try to do what we can to establish a timeline to complete it right now and move past that. And if the district is in need of additional days because of the sort of remote aspect of what we're doing, an evaluation, for instance, and as a family you're open to that, then sure, let's agree to a different timeline. Let's establish another deadline that we're all going to follow for ourselves and document that. That's perfectly fine. So those are the kind of conversations I think that the families can push, and it's certainly reasonable and within their right to point out that, you know, now that we're back here in the spring, or back here from the spring, in the fall, that we need to address, you know, any timelines that were missed. I think it's a good question. I'm going to use that, I guess, and then we'll kind of hit into our last segment here, and then that can get us a little bit more questions, because wanted to share an example of kind of what OSPI has been doing with respect to resolving disputes. I think that's one of the big questions, is as to how do we resolve kind of issues that we may be having that families are bringing forth, and procedural safeguards. I think it's important to always go back to that idea. You know, parents and families have procedural safeguards built into the rules and regulations of special education. The sort of first column here, those points are the, I would say, I always consider them the highlights when it comes to procedural safeguards. There's still the expectation that districts are communicating with you as a family using prior written notice. But to document, this sort of documents what the district is proposing to do or what they're proposing not to do moving forward. You know, families have a safeguard to know anytime a decision is being made about how services are provided. Language access is still critically important. Even more so now when we're trying to talk about equitable outcomes for students, and that if a family whose first language is other than English, there are certain documents and communication that needs to be taking place using a qualified interpreter to make sure that families still have access to the information about their student services, and that they can participate in meetings regarding, you know, the provision of services for students. This is all still in place, and perhaps even more critically important now that we can't be face-to-face. Consent is still required. There's ways to provide consent remotely using electronic means, and districts have been guided and instructed to find safe and reliable kind of verified ways of obtaining consent. And this may even involve different steps of sending things through traditional sort of snail mail, or using email verification, DocuSign kind of technology, but consent is still required in particular places in the process. The independent evaluations, the requests that parents can still have a right to make, that's still possible during this situation. So that has not changed, to request independent evaluation at public expense. You know, parents still have a right to access records. All the disciplinary protections are still in place as well. Even if, for instance, if for some reason discipline is still coming up. The second column talks about the more formal dispute resolution safeguards that families have. All of these are still in place. Mediation services, IEP facilitation, they can happen remotely still. Sound Options is the name of the group designated by the state to be the provider, and they have folks all over the state who can do these types of situations remotely if necessary. The special education, what used to be called citizen complaint, will hopefully be changed to a community complaint going forward once the state rules get updated. And I'll talk about some examples of complaints that have come into OSPI. That's a more formal complaint to OSPI that the district is somehow not in compliance or following rules and regulations. And the right to go to a due process hearing still exists for families, and that's a hearing before an administrative law judge. Here's the examples I wanted to pull from recent complaints. There's been some little questions about, what is the expectation for districts? And this information gets shared with districts as well. So this is something that I think is helpful for everyone to know as to kind of what does OSPI see as the way forward, using examples from the type of complaints that we get. So this past spring, one of the big picture ideas, we've investigated at least 20 or more complaints regarding what happened in the spring. Sort of the common themes are that there were no violations for failing to implement an IEP as written, because it was essentially, not possible in all cases there. So, to require districts to follow IEPs minute by minute as they were written is just sort of an unworkable standard. And we have not found any violations on that grounds or that case, in those cases. If the district, to the second point here, was maintaining documentation they were doing during the spring building closures and the summer, if they used a continuous learning plan, the CLP, if they were documenting progress reports in some way, still following that met the standard. That was no violations for doing that. Now, so the areas where OSPI has been finding districts out of compliance or findings against the district for violations, for the third point here, it talks about delays in making special ed services available when buildings will close. And this is because of that expectation that we talked about already, that from the superintendent's office, that continuous learning was to take place beginning March 30th of 2020. And so if there was any sort of delay or sort of lack of action on the part of a district to make any services available starting that date, then that was a real problem that we called out, and we would make a finding against the district for not being in compliance. Similarly, that fourth point here is that if districts failed to monitor any progress or document that progress or the lack thereof during the closures, it wasn't simply enough to say we couldn't do anything because buildings were closed. The expectation was that you still follow the IEP sort of timelines in terms of how frequent progress reports need to be given to the family, and then be upfront about the fact that, we were not able to collect information, but here's what we were able to see, or here's where we were at this point. So some kind of documentation of progress and what happened was an expectation that we've been holding districts to. And this last point I think is very important because it sort of ties into how we started this whole conversation. There's been findings against a district for failing to even provide support or access to a general ed class setting. In the spring, if classes were having meetings remotely, or teachers were having office hours, even this peer connection, sometimes there were like social groups being arranged to connect remotely. Particularly when the gen ed setting was listed in the IEP as the least restrictive environment for a student, and that was the setting that was most appropriate for the student. If a district was not taking the steps to make sure that students still had access to that general ed setting, even though it's remote, OSPI made sure to have a finding against the district for that. And typically the type of corrective action or the direction for remedies from OSPI is to have an IEP team meeting. This might be a situation where compensatory education is ordered in some of those cases, make up for minutes lost. This may be a situation where an IEP team was ordered to meet to discuss recovery services. So that gives the team a little more flexibility in terms of crafting a remedy for how, the spring affected the student in that way. OSPI sometimes has been ordering training to districts on how do we do this in a remote context, like, for example, progress monitoring. How do we train our staff to collect the information that we need and have a conversation about that, given the remote constraints. So I point this out not to say that, all the districts are doing the wrong thing. I'm saying this because, this comes up frequently from families. They'll ask me, what does OSPI think about, the district's actions? And when we get a complaint decision, there's an investigation that takes place. And these are the types of findings, I think, that are instructive going forward for what districts and IEP teams can do next. And it sets sort of guidelines or priorities that we've already talked about. This is where some of these priorities have come from after assessing what's going on in the state. And so this is an example that, families I think are important to know about. This is that was sort of the last big point I wanted to make. I'll make this presentation available, obviously, for the links and for reference for everybody. I'm working remotely because the OSPI building is closed. So that's why I have an office number and a cell number. Email is probably the easiest way to reach me because it's, we've got continuous learning going on, distance learning going on in my household too. So I don't know when I'll be able to get back to everybody all the time, but at least I'm available in this way. So you could reach out to me if there's sort of follow-up questions at any time, or reach out to our office. Someone will get back to you at some point. And there's also resources within our state more broadly that perhaps we can direct you to. But I do want to stop, even though I've sort of reached my formal end, I want to make sure that we can answer any questions that may have come up. Based on anything we talked about, we can revisit something if necessary.
I'll also stop the recording just in case anybody's worried about privacy. So.
Okay, thank you.